This is Metro Week. Our top story, wildfire and bighorn sheep in the Catalina Mountains. We'll find out how the recent fire may affect the animals and get an update on their health. Then our Journalists Roundtable analyzes the week's news.
Welcome to Metro Week. I'm Andrea Kelly. For decades, wildfire suppression was the mantra for public land managers. But now, the role of fire in the ecosystem is being acknowledged and allowed to run its natural course. Zach Ziegler takes us to the site of a fire this month in the mountains north of Tucson.
It still smells like fire at the end of Finger Rock Trail. The fire burned across the path after it spilled out of neighboring Pontotoc Canyon, where lightning sparked it July 29th. The fire was declared fully contained on August 11th after burning 750 acres in the Pushridge Wilderness. Officials at the Coronado National Forest chose to manage the fire, which was highly visible from Tucson, instead of suppressing it. One reason, the rough and rugged terrain of the canyons where the fire was burning.
The terrain is really steep. There are vertical rock faces. It's very rocky. So the terrain was one consideration for firefighter safety, which was our number one objective. So if there wasn't a reason to put firefighters at risk, that was something we took into consideration.
Another reason that led Coronado officials to choose management over suppression, fire's natural role in Arizona's ecosystem and its long absence in the area.
That area usually burned every 10 to 12 years, and it hadn't seen fire in over 80 years, so it really needed to have fire come in there to do its job.
A lack of fire in the area meant it had become overgrown with brush, trees, and other woody species of plants. And those plants are a less desirable food source for herbivores in the area.
So what we're going to see now is more lush vegetation coming up where it had been really woody and brushy. That's going to be more nutritious, more beneficial to wildlife, and overall it kind of refreshed the landscape.
Small sprouts are already growing in some of the burnt areas, and that's good news for some of the area's newest inhabitants. Efforts to reestablish bighorn sheep in the Catalinas began nearly 2 years ago. The species had lived in the mountains indigenously, but died out in the 1990s. Fire could play a role in restoring the habitat of the bighorn.
Fire is a natural part of how things work up there. Fire had been excluded, so the area was in an unnatural condition.
And letting the mountains return to their natural condition could be a benefit to the animals that call this rugged terrain home.
To find out more about the ecology of fire in the bighorn sheep habitat, Vanessa Barchfield interviewed Mark Hart, the Public Information Officer in Southern Arizona for the State Game and Fish Department.
How did the recent fire here affect the herd of bighorn sheep?
Well, it's a little early to tell, but this is what we hope for. In the very near future, a lot of new growth at the ground level of green leafy plants that will be good forage for bighorn sheep. But we also hope to see, and we know it's the case at higher elevations, the clearing of dense brush. All that good food on the ground won't do the bighorn sheep any good if they're heads up and on a swivel looking for predators. And the clearing of the brush will give them a defense against predators. They'll be able to see them.
So you think actually this fire could be a positive thing for them?
Oh, absolutely. We think it's positive, as is the Buster Mountain fire. We know that some bighorn sheep are already using that habitat because there's new growth coming up, and that's exactly the kind of food they're looking for.
Can you catch us up to speed on the program a bit? Where are we at now?
Well, we currently have 37 bighorn sheep in the Pushridge Wilderness. We did our second transplant of sheep in November of 2014, and we hope to do a third transplant in November of this year.
How many of the original herd are still alive? How many births have we seen?
Well, this year we've had a bumper crop of lambs. We have observed 16 lambs on the ground, and we really can't track them because unlike the other sheep, they're not fitted with GPS collars. We're going to be surveying the lamb population in the next 2 weeks, and we should know more. I should point out that bighorn sheep survival rates are relatively low, about 25%. Nonetheless, we hope to see at least 4 or more up there.
Are they mostly sticking together, or do they go off and explore on their own?
Bighorn sheep don't form a classic herd with all the animals bunched up. They tend to stay in the same general area in small groups. But the basic area where they can be found is this north or the southwestern slope wrapping around to Push Ridge of the Catalinas. That's the best habitat for them. That's why we put them in where we did in 2014, as close as possible to the existing herd.
How do you decide when it's time for a new release?
Well, the timing on it has a lot to do with the availability of sheep from elsewhere in the state. We do our Bighorn surveys in October, and then we know where we can take them from. But they are always done typically in November because it's early enough in the pregnancy of any ewes that they will survive the process of capture and release.
We haven't heard anything about mountain lions recently or predation. Does that mean that the animals are actually getting along better?
The bighorn sheep are exactly where we need them to be right now, in the Push Ridge wilderness, in very steep terrain with good line of sight to evade predators. Initially, after the first release, the bighorn sheep dispersed widely, and many of them got into unsuitable habitat. And by that I mean not steep and rocky enough and with too much brush. They were easy prey for the mountain lions at that time, but now that they're where they're supposed to be, it's much harder for mountain lions to get to them.
At what point will you be able to call the program a success?
We're not calling it a success yet. The target was to have about 100 to 120 sheep up there within 3 years. That seems rather optimistic at this point, but after a third release, we'll assess how we're doing, and possibly then we could say we're done with translocations and the bighorn sheep are on their own.
And at that point, will the organization start issuing hunting tags?
Oh no. Hunting tags may be available at some time in the distant future, but it typically takes in Arizona 9 years for a herd to become self-sustaining. And so we wouldn't take them any sooner than that. And I should add that that's not the major goal of the project. Arizona Game and Fish will never recover its $500,000 investment in this program by selling hunting tags. Hunting tags for bighorn sheep are extremely hard to get. They're extremely limited, and there's a process by which hunters must bring them into us after they're done with the hunt. So it would be no more than 1 or 2 a year.
How has public perception about the program changed?
Well, we can't measure it. We can't do surveys or polls like a political campaign does. So a lot of our evidence is anecdotal. And to the extent we haven't lost a lot of sheep, as we did in the first year of the program, there haven't been any mountain lions removed as a consequence of the program, I'd say we have broad-based support. Remember, we undertook this program with an advisory committee of blue chip environmental and sportsman organizations, and they were at our right hand every step of the way on all aspects of this project. So we got buy-in before we even put any sheep on the ground.
Hi, I'm Lorraine Rivera. Tonight on Arizona Week, leaders from throughout the state are in Tucson, how a conference connects communities.
Over 1,000 people attending this conference every year, and it's really become a must attend for people in the government sector.
Now our Journalist Roundtable. Joining me in the studio are my colleagues Vanessa Barchfield and Zach Ziegler of Arizona Public Media, David Repcalvis of Tucson Local Media, and Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. Now, Zach, the Forest Service got a lot of calls about why it was not fighting that fire that you covered in our opening package. You actually went on that hike up to that site to get that video. What did you see when you did that?
I saw 12 miles round trip going up 3,800 feet in elevation of brutal trails that there would have been nowhere for firefighters to set up, basically. There was quite often parts where it was a steep drop on my left and a steep hill on my right. There would have been nowhere to camp. There would have been nowhere to set up fire breaks. It was just wise to wait a little further back when the terrain got flatter, and that was basically what they did. They said, we're going to let this clear out dead vegetation, and if it starts getting close to structures, we're going to actively get on it then, because that area needed to be cleared out, as we heard Heidi Schul say in the package. It'd been a very long time since it burnt, and there was nothing of human value up there.
Is that one of the big reasons, the fact that structures were not right there, were not actually at risk? Is that kind of one of the driving forces, or was it also the vegetation 50-50?
It was a nice bit of both. There was no reason to not just manage the fire as opposed to actively trying to put it out. So since there was no reason, at this point, we've seen how wildfires are around the country this year. You need to save funding wherever you can. So there's no reason to use that money on a small fire that isn't endangering anyone's house or any person or any, object of historical significance.
I think it's actually really good news when they let Mother Nature do what she does best. Fires are supposed to burn on mountains. I've covered fires in 3 different states, and the biggest, most dangerous ones, the ones that destroy homes and destroy property and threaten lives, are the ones where they don't ever let things burn naturally. They see a spark, something goes up, and they immediately send out helicopters and firefighters and put it out. 10 years later, that underbrush that would have been cleared out is now just burning crazy. And you go from a 175-acre fire to a 10,000, 100,000-acre fire where there's homes destroyed and people's lives destroyed because they don't let Mother Nature work. So I think it's really good news they're letting Mother Nature just do what she does.
Yeah.
Fires are good.
Yeah, and it really does play a role. When you get a fire like this, it can burn at a medium to low intensity. Thanks to this being monsoon season, it didn't get to be a big out-of-control fire. You see in that video footage that there were plants that lived right through this, no problem. And you see also that there are plants that have already sprouted up. There were little, inch and a half tall
I know, that was incredible
sprouts.
to see in that video.
Yeah.
It seems like this fire got more attention because of where it was, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there it was above Tucson, glowing at night beautifully, actually. Is this a fire that normally would have just gotten no attention at all if it were somewhere else?
Yeah, if it were on the backside of the mountains, we might have heard of it because you'd have seen little plumes of smoke. But quite often, it seems the rule of thumb is you don't really cover a fire until someone's property is in danger of being damaged. That's when things start getting talked about, or if the smoke's coming into a major city. So yeah, if this would have been a different location, we might not have never heard its name.
Do you have any indication about, will we have any more wildfires in the mountains? Is there any other area that needs to be cleared out?
There's always the chance. There is plenty of land that hasn't burned in a very long time. If you just look at the rest of that video, I mean, it was literally just us walking along and going, okay, this is just overgrown right here. This is an area that didn't burn versus this is an area that burned. You can just see the difference. And
You could see how dense it was in the parts that didn't burn.
And most of the land up there hasn't burned. And most of the land throughout a lot of the mountains here hasn't burned, as well as a lot of the wild desert lands also. So there are plenty of chances, and we've got plenty of monsoon storms ahead of us, which are quite often the thing that sparks those fires.
Now, Vanessa, I want to shift to the Bighorn side of the conversation, but before that, you reported late last week that some of the bighorns that have recently died in the Catalinas had pneumonia, and that didn't get in the interview because of timing and when we did this. What was the cause of that?
Right, that news broke just after I did that interview, actually, which is why we didn't discuss it. So in the last few weeks, 3 ewes have died. The first one was initially reported to have died after falling off a cliff. Game and Fish took tissue samples, sent them to a lab, and they, of course, came back showing that that ewe had died of pneumonia. 2 subsequently passed away as well. Pneumonia is considered a major threat to bighorn sheep populations. It's caused serious drops in bighorn populations across western states. So this is something that Game and Fish are taking very seriously. There's no treatment or cure for it, and we don't know how sort of widespread it is amongst that population right now.
How do they get it?
Usually it's transmitted from domestic goat or sheep to the wild populations. Game and Fish doesn't know. It could have also come from one of the translocated sheep that was previously exposed to it, but they don't know quite yet.
What does it mean for the future of the relocation program?
Well, Game and Fish says that they're going to continue planning for another release this November. That will be the 3rd release, and that's a pretty important one. They say it's easier to cancel the release at the last minute if it turns out there is a widespread outbreak. Thank you. Contamination outbreak in the population. It's easier to cancel it than scramble last minute to put one together. They're closely monitoring the existing sheep, and they say that they should know more in the next few weeks. So probably in September we'll know more.
That's really interesting.
So Vanessa, I know early on after the releases and even before the releases, there was a lot of concern. I know I was one of the people who raised it about the limits of how many mountain lions they would kill on Mount Lemmon in order to preserve or establish a bighorn herd. So it now seems that we've moved away completely from that threat because they've killed the, or what's going on with that?
Well, I asked Mark Hart about that, and he said essentially, when you introduce bighorn sheep, they're still figuring out the terrain, and that makes them more vulnerable to mountain lions, which obviously they prey on bighorn sheep. But now they've sort of figured out the terrain, and they're seen as being much sort of safer and established in the Catalinas already.
Now, Tim, last week our show was almost entirely about the Suntran bus strike, and here we are again, and it's still happening.
Yeah.
And you've written about it in the last few weeks as well. Are the parties talking at all?
No, they're not talking. So the going back, the union, the Teamsters, made a contract offer, and the company that manages Suntran, Professional Transit Management, they made what they called a firm and final offer. The two were very far apart, and then the strike occurred. About a week ago, the Teamsters came back and made an offer that was about half the cost of the previous one that they had made, according to Professional Transit Management.
Let's put a number on that. It's
Yeah,
about
okay. So
11
initially,
million.
the initial offer, the company said was worth about 21 million over 3 years. This offer, that the proposal by the union, is about 11 million, according to the company. It's still something that the company says is way too expensive. And so while the company has offered to sit and negotiate, the union has rejected that, saying that they are just trying to get, it's a publicity ploy on their part, that they should make an offer if they want to negotiate in earnest.
And so we haven't heard any new offers from Suntran, just a willingness to talk.
Right,
Okay.
and yeah, that's been my complaint, that while I do appreciate their willingness to talk, I mean, there's no talk like an offer, You make an offer, and then there's something that you can deal with. But of course, they're limited because this is not a company that has, some bank accounts it can dip into and bring some extra money to the table, whatever. It all comes from the city and local public sources, other than the federal government.
Professional Transit, of course, is a private company, but do you think that there will be any political fallout as a result of this strike?
Oh yeah, well, so my column today was about the possibility of establishing a regional transit entity that could run all the aspects of transit in Peanut County, and I think most of the city council is anxious to try to set such a thing up. The council rejected an idea like this back in 2010. When the Regional Transit Authority brought it to them. But the terms and the personalities were different at that time, and I think the strike brings some urgency to trying to get a more direct relationship between the people who provide the money and those who operate the system.
So at this point, it almost seems like we're seeing kind of the feudal-style siege warfare where both sides are just waiting for the other side to blink and run low on supplies. Is there any sign that either side is going to start having to cave in? Or, I mean, how are things working, I guess, both financially for the union workers and for the bus system?
Well, so the bus system, the way it gets paid is by sending invoices to the city. So the city pays them for the work they've performed. And they are not performing as much work now because the strike is on, but they're still getting paid. And
by which you mean like the administrators, like the things to keep Suntran functioning at this lower level are
Right,
still
yeah.
being paid for?
Both the administration, the management, and the operation of the skeleton crew and the few routes that are going right now, they're
not
getting paid
the
for.
full
Yeah.
rate because they're not running the full system.
Sure, right. But now, of course, they would prefer to run the full system, and what's more important, probably winning in this labor negotiation for them. But it might be a short-sighted way of looking at things because, as I said, there's a lot of political angst now among the people who provide the funding and who might want to get rid of this system altogether of hiring a third-party company to run Suntran.
But that also has implications on the city's federal funding for this system, and the city at this point can't get involved in negotiations because of that federal funding. So changing the structure is more than just about changing the money.
Right. Well, the key, as we've all learned over this period, the only reason that there is a third-party company operating this is because operating Suntran is because in order to receive federal funding, they have to offer strike rights to the employees, and the city charter forbids that. So, but if you were to set up a third an entity that's not the city, that is some sort of regional transit entity, they could, since they don't have a charter that forbids strikes, they could potentially get federal money still.
So you wrote in support of this idea today. Who else is on board?
Oh, well, the mayor, most of the city councils. Karen Ulick is one of the big proponents. She's, and of course, one of the big proponents of transit in the city. Every council member I talked to, which was 3 plus the mayor, was in support of the idea. So I think but the problem is in the details of who runs the system, and that's hard to work out.
And if that comes to be, will there be major differences, major restructuring that the riders would notice?
Well, it's so far off now that it's just an idea, but it's unlikely that it would have a drastic effect on routes and stuff like that right away. I mean, it would be more of a governance thing than the day-to-day stuff.
That's the long-term answer.
Yeah.
Is there a short-term answer anytime? Do you see an end to this?
Well, the thing is that, as the way I view it, the company has all the leverage here because they can just keep going. They say they don't have the money to make concessions, and the only people who really are pushing to get this thing ended are the politicians who don't have any leverage in the negotiation.
Okay, I have a hypothetical, which you might not have the answer to. So Suntran doesn't have the money. The city obviously controls the budget for the company. If the city council decided to change the Suntran budget this year, found some money, which they don't really have sitting around, but if they found a way to give Suntran more money, could that change the negotiation?
I think
standpoint?
so. Yeah, I mean, I think they could probably do that. Yes, then that would be a natural way for this thing to be resolved. Someone needs to make an offer that maybe saves face for the Teamsters, gives them a little something, and lets them approve a contract, move on to the next negotiation in 3 years.
All right. Well, more to come on this as we go. We don't know how long we'll be talking about this. David, I want to shift to the cover of Inside Tucson Business this week. You looked at the economic impact of schools. What did you find?
It's huge. It's interesting. In Tucson, TUSD, a lot of the news you're hearing is that their student numbers are dropping, their number of employees are dropping, their budget has to drop. But when you look at Pima County as a whole, the economic impact of schools is massive. The outlying areas, Marana, Vail, Sahuarita, their school districts there are their biggest employers in the whole city. In Tucson, TUSD has almost 6,000 people that work for. That's 6,000 jobs. That's a really big impact to our economy. So schools, public schools in general, are a massive economic engine.
So is there a dollar figure for that economic impact as a whole, aside from just the people employed?
It's hard to come up with an exact number. The school districts in Pima County have an economic budget impact of over $600 million.
That's how much they spend.
That's how much their budgets are for this year. That amount, about 65% are going to go to employees. So 2/3 of that $600 million is going to be spent on salaries and benefits for employees, which is then turned around and spent most of it in our community. The remaining 1/3 is spent for vendors, and a lot of that is even local money. I mean, local contractors are helping repair schools or build schools, local companies that are supplying food for lunches, local companies that are helping, maybe give uniforms for the football team. So a lot of that is spent locally, but there's a huge impact.
So this is all money coming from us, we the taxpayers, going to the schools, right? I mean, it's not like we're selling missiles or something and getting the money back from like the schools are selling missiles, then that would be something. And getting money back
More
from
hypotheticals.
out of state, yeah.
No, almost all the money comes from two sources. It comes from property taxes in Pima County, and it comes from state taxes. But ultimately, it all comes from taxpayers. That's correct.
We tend not to think of schools or call schools our biggest employer because we're looking at single employers. So Raytheon, U of A, and Davis-Monthan. But as a sector as a whole, you're saying public school, public education is. What does that mean when we hear about state budget cuts, since we're talking about taxes and?
Anytime there's budget cuts, anytime there's reduced students, which is how they get their money, it leads to less money and therefore less teachers and less of an economic impact. And what's interesting around here is that there's really a shift. You're seeing a lot of students leave TUSD more in the central Tucson, and even parts of Amphi School District, they're leaving, like Amphi High School is shrinking, but their two high schools up north are growing. So students seem to be moving from the center of town to the outskirts, and it's not just north, because Vail has grown immensely down south. So I mean, there's a lot of people leaving the center of town, and therefore those school districts are being forced to shrink. TUSD's even had to close schools, whereas the outlying areas are opening new schools and growing quickly.
And what about the impact of charter or the role of charter schools?
Charter schools impact everything. You know, charter schools are interesting because they are public schools, free public schools, and yet they are given the freedom to almost act like private schools. So you have a lot of kids that, and you know, charter schools impact public and private, because you have a lot of kids whose parents may have been spending $1,000 a month to send their kid to a private school. They can now do it for free and send them to a charter school where they have more control over what types of things are taught.
When you did your analysis, did you include charter schools in the dollar amount and the employees? Okay.
No, the numbers we're talking about are strictly the public school districts.
All right. I'm going to switch to another topic that you've been writing about, Tim, which is this effort, statewide effort to rebrand Arizona. You wrote that the Commerce Authority, or is the Commerce Authority,
yes,
right?
it's the Commerce Authority.
Is prompted this at Governor Doug Ducey's suggestion. Why are you critical of the effort?
Oh, I wouldn't say the efforts, it's fine. But my point was that the reason that Arizona has a negative image in some parts of the country is because of the reality of things such as our poor school funding, that sort of thing. And while, you know, a rebranding effort might be worthwhile, it might be better just to fix the real problem, the underlying problem that's causing the poor image.
Do you think that the people who proposed this think it's actually just an image problem?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of this discussion, that there's a large sector of Arizona, especially some of the Republican Party members who run the state government, who think that the problem is all the criticism, not the actual reality of Arizona. But there are a lot of us also who think that it's the reality that's the problem.
Now, you wrote a column and you prompted people, or you asked people to weigh in on some suggested slogans, and I've seen this in other news outlets around the state as well, so I want to hear some of your favorites.
Oh, well, okay, let me think. A lot of people use Grand and tried to work in the Grand Canyon State theme. A weird one that kind of stuck out for me was Grand, Canyon State.
That's interesting.
But most people who sent in the ideas sent in more sarcastic ones, like, what was it? 49th in education, but first in our heart, with first spelled F-U-R-S-T and heart spelled H-A-R-T.
Nice.
Yeah, right, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of sarcastic or facetious poking fun at the state for its problems.
Okay, so a lot of poking fun. What's the ratio that you saw in just, informal survey?
Yeah, well, my little thing turned out
positive to negative.
I think it was a 5-to-2 ratio. 5 sarcastic or funny or facetious ones to every 2 serious, sincere slogan ideas.
This was a joke on social media, right? But is it actually happening? I think they've already hired
right.
the firm,
So the Arizona Commerce Authority is spending the money to hire a firm. Coincidentally or not, it's a firm that worked for Doug Ducey's Cold Stone Creamery back years ago. And they're going to do a public info gathering effort and eventually come up with ideas for not just a slogan, but for iconography and that kind of thing that can promote Arizona. I mean, in the end, we do need it. We do. But yeah, I mean, I think there are problems that we could just as well fix, and maybe that would help our image more.
What's the budget on this effort?
I don't know, and we don't know. It's coming out of the Arizona Commerce Authority marketing budget, I believe, which I don't know the value of.
And so much of the Commerce Authority decisions are not public right away, so
Right.
we'll wait and find out that one.
Yeah.
That's all the time we've got for today. Thank you all for joining us. As usual, all the stories we produce at Arizona Public Media are available on our website. There you can listen to stories, play a live stream from NPR 89.1, and watch past episodes of this and other TV shows. Thanks for watching.